What's up, YouTube? So today I want to show you 5 common grooves used in full-on psytrance bass lines. So I'm not going to do too much about the melodic aspects here. I will throw in a little bit. I just want to focus in on the grooves. So I've done so many tutorials on how to make the bass sound itself. You can definitely go check those out on my channel. So I'm not going to go too much into how to actually make the sound itself. But I'm still getting a lot of comments on my channel about, can you remake this bass line? Can you remake this bass line from all these different tracks? And most of the time, they're pretty much the same thing. It's just that the key of the bass is different, or the groove of the bass is different, and stuff like that. So I want to show you guys a bunch of different grooves that you can use, and hopefully it'll spark some inspiration, and you can take it further. Anyway, without blabbering too much, these are some quick examples of what we're going to look at in this video. So the first groove that I want to talk about is called the offbeat groove. So this is a very simple pattern. It's essentially just a long legato single note that you want in the middle of every kick. So if we zoom into this MIDI over here and we just make these channels a little bit bigger, you'll see you've got the kick, and in the middle over here on the 1/8, you've got a bass note, and then another kick, and then a bass note. So it's this alternating on-off groove. Very, very simple, but very effective. So with these kinds of things, it does help to have a sound that has a bit of sustain. So you're going to want some sustain so that you've got that like long legato tail, so you can really get the full body of the sound. Does that make sense? So this might seem very simple for now, but in combination with some of the grooves that I'm going to show you a little bit later on, it can be really, really effective. You don't always want to give away your full power at the beginning of the track. You want to create this progression to a very powerful bass line. And sometimes just starting out with something simple like an offbeat groove like this can really do wonders. Sometimes you might also want to throw in a little bit of variation, say once every 4 bars. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this clip 4 times bigger by doubling it twice. And then here we can actually zoom into the clip, and then at the end of this bar we can maybe do a variation, like we can move up 1 semitone and then down 2 semitones, just for an example. Or sometimes you can incorporate some of the later variations, like a gallop up an octave or something like that, or up plus octave plus 1. But that's getting a little bit complex for so early in the video. So what I want to do is I want to show you guys the next variation. I haven't actually made this one because I actually want to make it with you folks to show you the actual sound that we're going to incorporate here. So this I like to call the call and response groove. You don't necessarily have to do this with the offbeat, but I just think, sequentially it works in this part. So I want to show you, essentially what we're doing is we're creating another variation of the bass line, which we're going to slot in every now and then. So traditionally you would hear this on the first beat. So it'll be like some kind of sound here, boom, da, 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 and then the full bass line would come in. So let's just, for example, once every 2 bars, I think that's 2 bars, we can just remove the first kick's worth of bass line. Does that make sense? So here, I just want to consolidate this clip so that we have an easier bit to work with that we can then duplicate this way. And now, if we duplicate this track, we can now select this and go Control A, Control X, And now we can actually add a new clip over here. So with this one, let's just create a 2-bar long variation like this, which we can spread along the entire bar like this. So now we can actually go in and, for example, let's put in a single note on the beat here. So because with this bass line, the kick is occurring at the same time the envelope starts, we've got it starting on the beginning of the bar, we don't necessarily hear the filter ring out because of the transient of the filter envelope. It's obviously modulating this down very quickly. We could potentially turn the decay or sustain up over here so that we've got a full note. But what I like to do is dial in some really fine settings here, like open up the decay a little bit, turn down the sustain, so you still have some filter movement, but it's just not as drastic. We can even do some attack, so it gets that like whop opening motion. So here what I want to do is I also want to set this polyphony down to 1. Let's set legato, glide, and then what we can do is we can add some portamento. So what that's going to do is we're actually going to have to program a different MIDI in. So for example, we can go up an octave and then slide down an octave. So it starts higher and slides down. Okay, so like I said, you can throw in any types of variations you want, like at the end of the bar here. I like, with these kinds of offbeat things, it's nice to remain really subtle and then just throw in some flair at the end of every 2 or 4 bars or something like that. You can really get a nice groove going that way. And to use kind of melodic patterns that you might use later on in the track is a really good idea, because you can kind of hint at things that are going to be introduced later on in the track so that when they do come in, they don't sound so foreign, if that makes sense. So the next groove is the gallop. This is just a very simple 2-beat on the offbeat. So instead of just a single note here, we have 2. We have 1 kick, and then halfway between the next kick, we have 2 bass notes. So it's an even kick, da-da-kick, da-da-kick kind of rhythm that we get going here with the gallop style. Again, like I said, you're not limited to using just these single grooves throughout your full track. This gallop is very, very powerful to use in the beginning, say, 2 minutes of the track. Then you have your kind of main breakdown and build up, and then in the main drop, you have a full-on rolling bass line coming in. Then you have that really big contrast between the kind of groovy bass and the full-on bass. And when it hits hard. So the next one is kind of, I call it the half roll, because it's kind of halfway between the gallop and the full-on roll. And the MIDI pattern that you generally draw out, a lot of people like to do this with velocity. I generally just do it with sidechain because it's so accurate that way anyway. You don't have to worry about each note being the same velocity value and all that kind of stuff. The MIDI pattern is the same as the full-on roll, but the main difference here is the sidechain pattern. So with the half roll, we generally go with something like very, very quiet first bass note. You see, out of those 3 bass notes, you barely even hear that first bass note out of the 3. This is a very nice way of being able to maintain a very powerful kick drum as well as a very powerful bass line, because you never have a point where the two are summing up and clipping or anything like that, because the first note is always so soft in volume. The problem is it's a very apparent galloping sound. Sometimes you want that very kind of wall of sound kind of tone that the full-on roll bass line gives you. You know, I prefer that kind of wall of sound that you get from the full-on roll. But again, like I said, in contrast, using these kinds of things in intros or in the first few minutes of a track can be really powerful when the wall of sound bass line actually comes in. Do you hear that? So as we start to introduce more of this shape like this, i.e. reduce the amount of sidechain that's happening on this first bass note, you start to almost hear there's like that clashing between the kick and the bass. So there are ways around this. So there's a very nice technique that I like to use, which I have explained in the sound design video, like on how to actually make the bass sounds. But I actually just want to quickly run through again, because I left a small little bit out of that video, if I'm not mistaken. So here, let's switch over to a new instance of Snap Peep, just so that we can turn them on and off when we need them for the different examples. And with this one, we can actually name plugins in Bitwig, which is pretty interesting. Let's call this Full Roll. And you'll see here, instead of being called Snap Peep, it's now called Full Roll, which is pretty interesting. Makes things a little bit easier when you're creating very complex racks of effects that you want to switch between and that kind of thing. Let's call this half roll. So with the full roll, we actually want barely no sidechain happening, because we're not going to do much volume amplitude modulation here. We're going to come back to this and we're going to fine tune this. But what I want to do is I want to split the fundamental from the wavetable, and there's an interesting way to do that, which I will explain shortly. Let's just check here what's happening on an oscilloscope. So because now we've increased the volume of this first bass note, it sums up with the tail of the kick, and you can see it actually peaks to a higher volume than the transient of the kick, which is not a good thing. So the idea is that if we remove the fundamental from the first bass note, then we will have much less issues with that, because obviously the fundamental is like the main amplitude of the sound, and just through a kind of psychoacoustic phenomenon, we won't really notice the missing fundamental so much. We'll just feel that there's no bass in the sound, but it won't really matter, because the kick's tail will be supplying the bass for that part, if you guys are following. So what I want to do is I quickly just want to duplicate this. We can call this fundamental, and we can call this harmonics. Okay, so with the fundamental, what we want to do is we actually want to use, instead of the direct harmonic editing, we want to use the filter style editing. And we use this to carve out the exact harmonics. Reason being is when we modulate the sound, I guess in this example, there wasn't actually any modulation. But if you have like a sweep in your wavetable, then the editing tool will mess it up, whereas the filter tool leaves the sweep of your frames intact. In this case, there is no difference in the frames. We've just got a single cycle. But that's the one thing that I left out in that video, is for this to actually work for sweeping wavetables, you want to use the filter mode and then just switch it over here to high pass to remove the fundamental, and then very high slope. you won't actually get any phase issues as you would with a kind of analog style EQ or filter, because it's actually directly carving out the harmonics of the sound. So it's essentially the same as the harmonic edit tool, except for the fact that you can actually apply it across the entire sweep of the wavetable. Okay, I hope that made sense. So now this sound should be missing its fundamental. We can actually confirm that by looking at a spectrum analyzer, and you can see it's missing that lowest tone. And there it is. We've split it into another oscillator. When doing this, it's also important to just kind of volume check your sounds, because now obviously the mids are a little bit more pronounced. But anyway, that's contextual. So I also noticed, it's also something that one of my Patreons brought up, is that when you're doing this kind of bass with the splits, sometimes the filter envelopes on the effects section don't re-trigger exactly on the beat, on the transient, until you actually set poly mode on. So when you're doing the fundamental split technique, you also just want to use a polyphonic effects section, or you want to do the filtering on the actual oscillators themselves. So then here, let's put in a mix. And then what the mix is going to do is we're going to use this to modulate the level of the fundamental. And we can do this at a particular rate, or we could use the velocity to do it. So what I want to do is I want to set up a remap so that only when the velocity is over a certain percentage will it trigger the level up by 100%. And then let's say, for example, something like this. I just realized I've got velocity doing other stuff in this patch. So this is a good example of how in Phaseplant or Bitwig, we could potentially just switch this over to an MPE parameter, something like the timbre. So let's apply the timbre over here. And instead of shifting the velocity of these notes, let's actually just select them all again and put the velocity back to default. I think is 80%. And we can actually go to the timbre parameter over here. And for each of these notes, just shift the timbre downwards. So it's essentially just like another velocity parameter per note. So this should be triggering as we expect it to. Let's just check in the plugin. Yes, you see on the first note that level goes down. So let's check in oscilloscope. So you don't notice a huge amplitude difference in the sound, but look at the oscilloscope. There's quite a bit of amplitude difference there. How clean is that? And there's no phase issues, because the waveform of that tail of the kick, those subs, don't exist at any point at the same time where the fundamental of the bass exists, because by the time it comes in over here, halfway through the beat, then the kick's tail is finished. Do you hear how that kind of full-on roll with these slight variations on the first note, where you've removed that fundamental, just sounds so clean, it's so powerful, it's so full, and it's very different and very contrasted to that gallop bass. So they're nice to use in combination in a track, both as parts of an arrangement. So another little thing that I want to throw in here is something that often comes up, because I use this quite often, is the note choice of basses and which notes to modulate. So something that I like to do is to variate. So I often don't change the first note, except in very rare examples. So just look at the second and third notes in each of these beats. So generally speaking, I stick to a +1 or a -2 or the octaves of those. Right? And in each of these beats, let's say modulate 1 on the third and then the next one on the second. So I will very rarely have a part where it's just the last bit like this. For example, the the third every time. Because that just starts to sound a little bit repetitive. Something really cool to do is to modulate them with a bit of syncopation. So like, for example, go up and then on the third, then the second, then the third, and then none of them, and then like down on this one, for example. And then a nice trick is to just like randomly select stuff and move them up an octave. And then I guess the last little final tweaks are all intuition, you know, like here, for example, I can kind of hear a groove happening when this one goes down. So it'll go like up, down, up, down, up. Does that make sense? Awesome. That about sums it up. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.